In JavaScript, objects can inherit from other objects. In this video, I'd like to show you how that works. On the left, I've created an object and I've assigned it to a variable called child. And the child object has two properties called first name and last name. I've drawn the table form or representation of this object below to remind us that this object is just a container for properties and values. To access one of the properties on the object, like we've been doing before, I can use the dot notation or the index notation. So to grab the value of first name, I can type child.firstName. Now what the JavaScript runtime, or the code that's running our program, is going to do is it's going to start off by looking at this object right here. And it says, is there a property in that table or that object called first name? It'll find it, and so then it will return the value for that property. And in this case, the value is this string called evented. Now it turns out that this object has another property on it that we've seen before that's created for us automatically. In the table here, I'll draw the extra property. It's normally __proto. And then __. The underscores just indicate that it's intended to be a private property, so we're not supposed to assign or mess with it directly. And that property will point to another object. I'll show you an example of that in a second, but let's go over to the debugger and look in the Sources tab so we can see the proto property ourselves. I've clicked on the Sources tab, and in the Watch Expressions, I'll click the plus button to create a new one. And I'll type child so that we can inspect the object that's been assigned to the child variable. When I expand this, you can see the proto property here, and you can see its value is an object. Now, we didn't assign this object or this property ourselves, and so somehow this has happened automatically. I'll talk about what this object is a little bit later. But let's try to assign this property ourselves to another object so that we can see how it works. I'm going to create another object here called parent. And the parent object will have one property called toString, and its value will be a function. And what I want this function to do is to return the result of getting the value of the first name property plus a space, and then the value of the last name property. And now what I want to do is to have the child object inherit from parent so that we can access this method from the child object. To do that, we can take the child object's proto property and just assign it to the parent. You normally wouldn't do it like this, but I'm going to show you this way so that it's more clear what's happening. I've drawn the table for our new parent object over here, and you can see it just has one property called toString, and its value is this function. And we've taken the proto property of child and assigned that to our new parent object like this. Now, the way property lookup works in JavaScript and with objects is if we try to access a property on an object, the JavaScript runtime will first look in this immediate object right here. And this is called the own object. So just a little bit of vocabulary. This is called the own object. So it'll go through this list and see if the property exists. So for example, if we're calling the toString method on child, I'll type child and then toString. What this will do is first start the lookup process in the own object, and here we have three properties: first name, last name, and __proto_, and it doesn't find any toString property in that first object. So what it will do automatically is look at what the proto property points to. In this case, it's just another object, and so it follows that chain, and this here is called a lookup chain. So I'll put this in quotes again. This is called a lookup chain. And it finds this parent object and starts to go through that list of properties. And there it finds the toString method, and so it returns the value for this property. And we can see that value is a function, and here's what it looks like. And so this looks exactly like the property up here. Now I can even call this function just like any other one, and it returns the first name and the last name with a space in between. I've cleaned up the drawing a little bit, and I'd like to show you what's happening when this function gets called. We've already talked about how the lookup process works and how JavaScript was able to find this toString function in the parent object. But one thing that might be a little bit confusing is how does it know where to find this first name property? In other words, what does this point to inside of this function? The answer is that it points to the first object in the chain. In other words, the own object. But then every property lookup follows the same lookup chain that was followed when we tried to access the toString property in the debugger. So when inside of this function, we look and try and access the first name property, JavaScript first looks through this list here, and if it doesn't find it, it follows the prototype chain up to the next object and then looks through that list, and so on. In this case, it finds the first name and last name properties in the first object. A little bit more vocabulary. This object here is sometimes referred to as the prototype object, or sometimes as the prototypal object. But it's just vocabulary. Really, it's just another object that's pointed to by this special property. Now, if you try to access a property that doesn't exist anywhere in the prototype chain, then we'll get an error. For example, if I try to access a property called bogus, it actually just returns undefined because the property is not defined. But if I were to try to call that, it would say undefined is not a function because it can't find that property value anywhere in the lookup chain. Now this chain can be as deep as we want it to be. I could create another object called superparent. And I'll create another function there called toString. And this time it's just going to return superparent. And then I'll delete this property in the parent object. And let's make the parent's prototype pointer, or prototype property, point to the superparent. Now I'll go over into the debug console and I'm going to pull up the sources tab so that we can take a look at the child object directly. Now notice over here that when I expand the prototype property, it's going to show me the actual value, the object, the parent object. And right now, that parent object doesn't have any properties in it except for its own prototype property. And so here's the child object here, and we can see those properties here, the first name and last name, and then its special prototype property, which points to parent, and that's what we're looking at here. And notice parent just doesn't have any properties, and so it's empty, except it has its own prototype property, and that points to superparent. And so if I expand this property, you can see superparent. And superparent has a function or property defined on it called toString. So just like before, if we call the toString method on child, JavaScript runtime will proceed up the lookup chain until it finds an object in the chain that has a property called toString. And in this case, it finds it on the superparent. So this allows us to override methods simply by defining them lower in the chain. So for example, if I wanted to override the toString function in parent, I could just do that here. And we'll just add back the first name and last name functionality that we had before. Now when I type child toString, we get back evented mind. In this video, I showed you how an object can inherit directly from another object using a special property called the prototype pointer. In this case, we have child pointing up to parent, and then the parent object pointing up to superparent. And so we've created a chain of objects, and JavaScript can automatically look up properties, starting with the lowest object in the chain, going all the way up to the topmost object in the prototype lookup chain. And this is how inheritance works in JavaScript.